Heading into the Denmark Open Super 750, there were a number of things that I, alongside many other badminton fans around the world, were interested and excited to see. Yuta Watanabe, the two-time Olympic bronze medalist, was set to make his debut with his new partner Maya Taguchi. How would the champions and finalists from the previous week do this week? There was a potential exciting second round match in the men's singles between the current best of Europe Victor Axelsen against the player seen as the future of Europe, Alex Lanier. And there were plenty of other mouth-watering encounters, both set to happen or that could potentially transpire. But the biggest story of them all, the one the most people were interested in, was the return of the player who has won it all by 22, the Olympic women's singles champion An Se-young of Korea. The Olympic champion making her first appearance since claiming the Olympic title, that alone is already enough of a story. But in this case there was far more to it than that. Far more layers, far more questions that seemingly had little or no answers. But as the week progressed, those answers became a little clearer. They started to shift into focus. They were answers that weren't particularly pleasant to read about, hear from others, or even watch unfold on court. And I couldn't help but think that they were answers that would undoubtedly lead to harder questions. Questions which could have ramifications not just for those involved, but on a far wider scale. It's because of all of this that for this week's episode of Beckman's Breakdown, I've decided to put my 100% attention towards it. You could call it my first ever special episode of Beckman's Breakdown. This is the continuing saga of An Se-young versus the BKA.
And there she is, An Se-young, woman of the moment, who's garnered a lot of attention.
Okay, before I can get into what happened at the Denmark Open, I feel it might be best to quickly recap what got us to this point. This will help those of you who have no prior knowledge of the situation or a limited understanding of it. And I feel it will also ensure we are all on the same page as we move forward into the more nitty-gritty of this whole saga. However, before I dive into this, I want to say that for brevity's sake, I won't be diving into every small detail. If you want a really well put together video which explores a lot of the issues involved, then I suggest you check out This is Badminton's video on the topic. It is beautifully written and lays out the information on screen in a simplistic yet elegant way, a way that I could only ever dream of doing. Link for that video is in the description. Okay, so it all started on August 5th in Paris. An Se-young had just defeated Herbing-Zhao of China to claim the Olympic women's singles title, becoming the first Korean women's singles player to do so since Bang Sung-hyun in 1996. It was a moment that should have been joyous, one that both An Se-young and the whole Korean nation could have celebrated, and it was, for about half an hour or so. As in the press conference afterwards, An Se-young dropped a bombshell, criticising the Korean Badminton Association, the BKA, for a number of things, chief amongst them being the mismanagement of a knee injury that she sustained the year previous at the Asian Games. I was deeply disappointed with the national team amidst my injury situation. At this point, I don't think I can continue with the national team. As expected, this statement from An Se-young, mere moments after winning the Olympic gold, sent shockwaves around the badminton world. It was a story that quickly became sensationalised, spreading beyond the badminton world. Even publications like Unilad, a news site that usually deals in celebrity gossip, were reporting on it, with headlines on it about how the BKA were archaic and backwards, and that An Se-young was implying she would retire. That second point would be quickly disputed by An Se-young herself. However, this press conference by An Se-young had lit a fire that couldn't be stopped. It led to the public criticism of both the BKA and herself, with some saying that her criticism of the BKA at that moment took away from others' achievements, namely Kim Won-ho and Jung Na-yoon, who had won silver in the mixed doubles. These were criticisms that An Se-young took and subsequently apologised for, taking to social media to do so with 2 lengthy posts. It was also following this that Eun refused to talk any further about this issue, instead opting to wait to see what would come from the investigation led by the Korean government into the BKA. And it wouldn't take long before shocking stories started to emerge. The investigation unearthed more than can ever be imagined. There were reports of money embezzlement, collusion by senior officials with sponsors, and also a culture of bullying. That last point, bullying, thrust Eun back to centre stage of all of this, as it was reported that she was not just bullied, but forced to do chores for seniors and coaches, including washing the underwear of male players. What makes this even worse is that the investigation showed this was systemic, and that the BKA not only turned a blind eye to all of this, but even protected the bullies. As you can imagine, this can't have been an easy situation for Eun. I am sure she felt some sort of release to finally let it all out. 7 years of frustrations and anger that had only gotten worse over the last 12 months. But on the other side, she had now just publicly lambasted the BKA, an organisation that had been proven to not just allow actions such as bullying go on, but actively help the perpetrators. Add to this the media attention, daily articles, all with thousands of comments, both of which would have been a mix of positive support and vile negative hate. A private inbox that probably made that comment section look like a children's book in comparison. Then, just as a cherry on top, Eun was injured, still unsure of how that would play out. Well, I'm sure for those weeks following the Olympics, Eun felt a level of isolation and loneliness that not many of us can relate to. All of these bottled up emotions became all too apparent when Eun returned to action at the National Sports Festival at the beginning of October, as she burst into tears giving an interview after winning her first competitive match since the Olympics. "It was my first match since the Olympics, and I was so happy that many people still remembered and cheered for me. I felt pressure to do well, but I'm glad everything went according to plan. I think I waited 2 months for this moment. I just wanted those who came to watch and enjoy my game, and I expressed my feelings after the match." The pain of the past 2 months were clearly a lot for Eun, and even though most questions were centred around how she felt, her love for badminton and her triumphant return, there were 2 other questions that are important to what would unfold in Denmark just a week or so later. The first was about whether there has been any changes in the right direction at the BKA, a question Eun simply replied with, "I have nothing to say." And the other question was about the Denmark Open, as Eun's participation had been confirmed. "I was really exhausted preparing for the Olympics without any break, but I've rested well. My physical condition has improved, and I feel like I'm at about 70 to 80% of my best form now." So, with all of that information and backstory, it's now quite clear as to why heading into the Denmark Open, all eyes were on Eun, with a number of questions surrounding her, with 3 of the big ones being: what is the condition of Eun's injury? What would Eun's mental state be like? And what would her relationship with her coaches be like? 3 pretty big questions, and 3 questions which by the end of the Denmark Open, we got far more detailed answers to than anyone could have ever imagined. As early as the first round in Denmark, we started to get a pretty good idea of an answer to 2 of the 3 questions I have just asked. In her first match, Eun did start incredibly slowly, and it was immediately obvious that her right knee was nowhere near 100%. There did seem to be a little less strapping than what had been seen at the Olympics, but it was still heavily strapped, and whenever Eun was walking between points, there was a noticeable limp. Like I said, she started slowly, but once she got going, her class and ability shone through. It was helped by the fact that as talented as her opponent was, her inexperience did come through, and she was no match for Eun. I remember thinking whilst watching this first round that what Eun said after her opening match at the National Sports Festival was pretty accurate. She did look about 70 to 80% of her best. I'd put it closer to 70 than 80 though. Another thing I remember thinking whilst watching this was that An Se-young seemed different. She didn't seem as vibrant on court as I remembered her before. This was a feeling that wouldn't leave me as the tournament progressed, and for the life of me I couldn't figure out if I was seeing a different An Se-young, or that everything I had read and seen before had influenced my thoughts, and what I saw as less vibrant than before wasn't actually true. Even now, I'm not 100% sure, although what happened 2 days later in her second round certainly gave me a stronger conviction in what I was feeling. It also gave everyone an answer for that third question: what would An Se-young's relationship with her coaches be like? In her second round match against former world champion Ratchnuk Intanon all started similarly to Se-young's first round match. She got an incredibly slow start and found herself 11-7 down, the first mid-game interval, and it's here where something happened that would spark so much debate and intrigue online. Kim Hak-yeon, the head Korean coach, and Sung Ji-hyun, the head women's singles coach, came onto court to deliver some tactics, encouragement and words of advice. But instead of listening and taking it in, An Se-young did something else. She turned away from the coaches and never once acknowledged their presence. This happened at every single mid-game interval, with probably the worst one being the halfway point of the second game, where the indifference from both sides is so glaringly obvious. Of course, this didn't go unnoticed. Fans around the world were quick to post about this, posting still shots of these mid-game intervals, asking the obvious question: was An Se-young deliberately doing this or not? Opinions on this matter were divided. Some were convinced this was purposeful, yet others thought An Se-young was just catching her breath. Luckily for everyone, it wouldn't take long to get an official answer from An Se-young herself.
I watched you today when you come out to the break, and it seems like it's a total different situation with the coaches. Like you're turning their back, like you're not even listening to what they say. Is there something going on that still hasn't been solved?
Obviously the situation hasn't been fully resolved yet, so she's kind of in the process. It's a difficult situation to kind of talk.
So will we see you tomorrow in the same way with the coaches on court?
I mean, she expects that it will be the same tomorrow as well.
I have to say, these were some excellent questions from Camilla Martin, a former world champion and Olympic silver medalist herself. And the answers from An Se-young are interesting to say the least. But what struck me a little more wasn't what she said, but how she said it. To the first question, where Camilla is asking her initially about the situation with the coaches, you can see that An Se-young thinks long and hard about answering, and ends up saying things aren't resolved. A short and very diplomatic answer. Yet the second question, will she do the same thing to her coaches again in the next round? This time there is zero hesitation and a very definitive answer. Now, this answer would go on to have further repercussions, which I'll get into soon, but knowing that An Se-young was deliberately ignoring her coaches does throw up a different question. Why? Now, yes, what An Se-young has alleged against the BKA is incredibly damning, and the allegations did implicate the coaches, but was there more to it than that? Well, as it turns out, yes, and it involves one coach in particular, one of the two coaches that was with An Se-young in Odense. On the 6th of August of 2024, just one day after An Se-young's infamous Paris press conference, SBS reporter Ju Young-min posted this article following a phone call with An Se-young. Within this interview are many of the commonly known facts, namely the mismanagement of her injury. However, there's one other interesting part near the end, which states a quote from a member of the coaching staff, saying to Se-young, "If you are going to act individually, you should leave the national team." Now, this article doesn't state who this coach was, but many speculated, based on the timing as well as other factors, that it was Sung Ji-hyun. Sung Ji-hyun being the coach that was with An Se-young in Denmark, the coach she snubbed before everyone. What I will say before moving on is that if this is one of the main reasons for An Se-young ignoring Sung Ji-hyun, then it is quite sad, because before An Se-young's injury, these two seemed to have such a good relationship with one another. There seemed to be a really close bond. I can vividly remember how they celebrated together after An Se-young won the All England in 2023, embracing each other closely. And I can also remember watching a video on the YouTube channel Wonderplay Badminton, where they went through Soo-young's semi-final from that same All England against Tai Tzu-ying. They were constantly joking and having fun whilst delivering great insights. I remember thinking at the time that they had such a great coach-player bond. So it is sad to think that the relationship would go on to become this. Why Sung Ji-hoon would make such comments, I can only think of one justification, and that is that if bullying is systemic in the Korean system, then being the former #1 for Korean women's singles herself, she likely went through the same stuff. Maybe that should make her more understanding. I went through this and I don't want you to do the same. But maybe Sung Ji-hoon sees this as just customary. We all must go through this. Whatever the reasoning, it has led to the very real situation we saw unfolding at the Denmark Open. And like I said not too long ago, things were about to get worse. On quarterfinals Friday in the warm-up courts, Soo-young was seen all alone, completely ostracised by the coaching team. Not only this, but the coaches have stopped any of the other Korean players from helping Soo-young with her warm-up. For all intents and purposes, Soo-young was completely on her own, left to fend for herself, with the coaches likely having the belief, well, if you want to go independent, then you can do so now. This lack of help from both coaches and teammates would continue throughout the rest of the tournament, and would explain why in all of her matches Soo-young would always start so incredibly slowly. Something she was able to work around in the earlier rounds, but something that was just not possible when she came up against a very well playing Wang Ziyi in the final. Honestly, watching Soo-young throughout this Denmark Open was just hard to watch. She didn't seem to really be enjoying herself on court. She was making far more errors than I think I've ever seen of her. Her knee was clearly still hampering her. In all honesty, it looked no different than it did at the Olympics. She was completely alone, ignored by her coaches. In fact, right at the end of that interview with Camilla Martin, Soo-young asked her if she would coach her.
I can come and coach you. Yeah, of course. If I have the time, I'll come.
And even though Soo-young seemed quite happy to talk at length with Camilla Martin in her post-match interviews, there seemed to be a real underlying sadness to Soo-young. Unsurprising given everything she had been through in the last 2 months, as well as the Denmark Open itself. Honestly, Soo-young struck me as someone who doesn't quite know what her future holds. But what does it hold? Where do things go from here for Soo-young? What does Soo-young's future look like? It's the ultimate question that badminton fans are now pondering. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I have my own thoughts, and in all honesty I see 2 ultimate outcomes coming from this. But before getting to that, I have heard reports that in the immediate future, Soo-young is looking to undergo surgery for her knee. I don't know what her diagnosis is, but I do know that this Denmark Open was used as a test for Soo-young's fitness, and I think it was quite clear that her knee injury is in a similar position as before. Following this possible surgery, there will of course be a recovery period. How long is completely unknown. In the meantime, the ongoing situation between Soo-young and the BKA is likely to continue, most likely through the legal system. And it's here where I see those 2 possible ultimate outcomes. And they are, the BKA are going to allow Soo-young to go fully independent, no restrictions on playing international competitions or hindrance at qualifying for the multi-sport events such as the Asian Games and the Olympics. Basically an agreement similar to current independent players like Lee Zi-ja, Victor Axelsen, Anders Antonsen and Go Jin-wei. The other ultimate outcome is that Soo-young will retire. I simply can't foresee Soo-young agreeing to continue, but under the BKA. Not after all her very public accusations and criticisms of the organisation, and definitely not after all we saw happen at the Denmark Open. That bridge has been well and truly burnt. I feel this will be the case even if the BKA completely changes their coaching staff, something I'm not sure they'll do. Another thing that I feel is for certain is that this will become a legal battle. I say this because the current head coach, the other coach with Soo-young in Denmark, Kim Gak-yeon, said as much right after Soo-young's Olympic press conference. This is something I had expected since last year. They are talking about going to court with the Korean Badminton Association. On top of this, the BKA are no stranger to legal battles with players, having gone through a year-long battle with Ko Sung-hyun and Shin Baek-chol back in 2017 in regards to their wish to go independent. This was a huge case. It could be its own video for sure, but the crux of it was that the players did eventually win, and even though the BKA did seem likely to appeal, they opted in the end to change their rules. For An Se-young's situation, I fear they won't be as easy to let it slide. The only thing I see going in An Se-young's favour is that there is far more press coverage on this matter, the allegations are far more sinister, and it seems the majority of the public opinion is on her side. For me, I do sincerely hope, as do many others, that An Se-young is doing okay. I hope there is a light at the end of this dark and troublesome tunnel, a light that leads to not just An Se-young being able to come back and truly loving and enjoying every aspect of her badminton career, but a light that leads her to refinding her own personal happiness.